Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli. Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
la civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Grazie.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, one and all, to this evening on John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. Probably, I presume many or most of you know him. Conceived to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the death of this great English writer. It's an honor, and above all, a joy for me and my friend Beppe Pezzini to be with you this evening. Before diving into this in media res, a few words on who we are, and as you can see there's no moderator. We decided to present each other specifically for the friendship that's been born these recent years, even for our common passion for Tolkien. Next to me here is Giuseppe Pezzini, originally from Turin, but now a nationalized British citizen. Giuseppe lives in Oxford, which is Tolkien's home and where he's buried. And there he now teaches Latin literature and language at Oxford University. And he also directs a research centre on Tolkien. He's the author of many publications on Tolkien, among which I recommend a book forthcoming by from Cambridge University Press. It's in English, called Tolkien and the Mystery of Literary Creation. It's an amazing book. I had the honor and the pleasure of reading it before it came out.
Buonasera.
Good evening, everyone. I thank, first of all, the meeting for the invitation, for having invited me and Paolo, but first, for having dedicated an evening to Tolkien in a year that's so important. And I want to start to represent you, Don Paolo Prosperi, with me this evening. Don Paolo is a missionary priest of the Fraternity of St. Charles Borromeo, but he's also a theologian, a professor, and a writer. He's had 2 books come out this year, which I'd recommend, on Peggy, a beautiful one, and one on the figure of Don Paolo has carried out his mission first in Russia, in Moscow, for 5 years, and then in America for 9 years, in Washington. So he's seen from close up those 2 great ideologies of the 20th century, 2 ideologies which even today are still very pervasive, which are transforming themselves into a clash between East and West. 2 ideologies which absolutize 2 values which are at the center of the discussion for this evening, which is the values of the community, of connectivity, of the we, and that's the East, and the value of the individual, of the I, the West. But as you see this evening, for Tolkien, there's no conflict between these 2 values. The I and the we are 2 helices, 2 spirals of the same strand of DNA. and without them, the organism would die. So let's introduce this evening's theme and the journey we're going to do in the next hour or so. And I've also introduced the form of what we're doing, which will be a dialogue between me and Don Paolo, two people who've got different backgrounds, different ages, different sensitivities, and different ideas. When Paolo talks to me, we often discuss in a pretty fired up way. It's very good. So with Don Paolo and I have worked together in these last few years. But we've been very united by a great passion for the person we're talking about and for his work, a great artist, and working together we've become friends, companions. So this evening I'd like to share a friendship between me and Paolo, but above all a share of a three-way friendship, me, Paolo and Tolkien. I think I've already said enough there, and so let's go straight on to this journey together, which we'll do in 5 steps. It'll be a journey in 5 steps, which Paolo and I will alternate. So we talk about some people in the Lord of the Rings, sometimes one, sometimes other. Like they do in the Lord of the Rings, one and others will be guiding the journey. Thank you all for being with us.
Dunque.
So, if I was asked to say in one sentence to sum up what The Lord of the Rings is about, I think I'd answer like this. About the mission entrusted to Frodo Baggins, a hobbit, or a halfling of the Shire, his mission to destroy the Ring of Power, forged by Sauron, the Dark Lord, and in doing so free the peoples of Middle-earth from the threat of his power. So, we're all in agreement up to here. So, is that all? No, of course not. And yet, in a way, yes, it is. Since all the other adventures recounted in The Lord of the Rings only really make sense insofar as they connect in one way to another to Frodo's great quest. We shall return later to the importance of the interconnection that binds together the various quests and exploits of all the characters, and to the profound reasons for this. Here I'm first and foremost interested in focusing attention on a more basic fact. The Lord of the Rings is, first and foremost, the story of a paradoxical calling. The calling of little Frodo, the hobbit of the Shire, to take on a mission that is of absolute importance and surpasses all other, and also of great difficulty. It seems overwhelming. It therefore seems crucial to ask, what did the author want to express with this kind of choice of main protagonist? The answer to this question, as we shall see as we go along, isn't unequivocal. On the contrary, it's multifaceted. It's pluriform. Indeed, it could even be said that all the pieces of the mosaic that we're going to build in this hour or so are, in a certain sense, intended to bring us closer to an even richer answer to this single fundamental question. In this first stage of our journey, I'd like to focus on a first aspect, starting with a crucial passage in the book, in which the High King of the Elves, Elrond, reacts to Frodo's offer to take the ring to Mordor.
Cito.
I will take the ring, he said, though I do not know the way. Elrond raised his eyes and looked at him, and Frodo felt his heart pierced by the sudden keenness of the gaze. If I understand aright all that I've heard, he said, I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you don't find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who, of all the wise, could have foreseen it?
It's a kind of quote as if it was from the book of Isaiah here, but part of the fascination that radiates from The Lord of the Rings depends on this simple idea, so superbly expressed by Elrond. In defiance of the designs, the plans, and the calculations of the great, here is a hobbit chosen by destiny, kind of destiny with a capital D, to open a way to salvation, there where even the wise cannot find one. The epic, therefore, or rather the honour and the burden of performing feats that are worthy of songs and poems, is not the prerogative of a cast of the gifted, of superheroes, of the so-called greats. No, heroism is available to everyone, even half-men, little ones like Tolkien, who often called himself a hobbit through and through, and so, in short, like all of us. And it is so because each one of us is a participant, though we often do not realize it, in the same kind of cosmic conflict that the Lord of the Rings tells us about. This is, I believe, the first and not the least reason for the planetary success of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien certainly transports us into an imaginary world, the fruits of his extraordinary imagination. He calls it a kind of secondary world. And yet, in doing so, he speaks to us. He speaks about us, opens our eyes to the depths and the heights hidden within the folds of our apparently small existence. And so, by doing this, he reveals its true dimensions to us, gives us back the feeling of greatness hidden in real life, from which reading his stories seems to take us away. Reading Tolkien, therefore, travelling with Frodo and Sam, with Merry and Pippin, certainly also means temporarily kind of abstracting oneself from what we call real or ordinary life. But the fruit of this journey into the elsewhere, into the unknown, is actually a new vision of the here and now. It is the receiving of eyes capable of seeing the epic tale hidden within each ordinary day. A passage from the chapter called "The Healing Houses," which is very dear to me, says this all particularly beautifully. The hobbit Merry lies in bed recovering from the after effects of a terrible clash with the king of the evil Nazgul. Pippin, who has his friend, who's just come to visit Merry, invites him to smoke some good pipeweed. So he tries to console him by throwing in a joke.
We took some brandy bucks, the two families of Merry and Pippin. We can't live long on the heights, said Pippin. No, said Merry. I can't. Not yet, at any rate. But at least, Pippin, we can now see them and honour them. Those heights, the depths. I think it's best to love first what you're fitted to love, I suppose. You must start somewhere and have some roots, and the soil of the Shire is deep. Still, there are things deeper and higher, and not a gaffer could tend his garden in what he calls peace, but for them, whether he knows about them or not. I'm glad that I know about them, said Pippin, a little.
End of quote. Like Merry, we too are made to love the concrete place where we are placed, our garden, our shire. We are made to take root in a specific place, to cultivate it and to take care of it. And yet it is as true for us as for Merry that this caring, this love for our little garden is as if it received a strength multiplied by the knowledge of those deeper and higher things, which Merry and the reader alongside him come to know over the course of the great adventure that takes him far from the Shire, following his friend Frodo. So what deeper and higher things are we talking about? It has been said, in reality, our every gesture, however trivial it may seem, is set in the context of an epic confrontation, of a cosmic war in which the salvation of the world is at stake. Being aware of this, I'm happy to know them, says Merry. Being aware of this is exactly what frees us from the feeling of banality, of uselessness, and the meagerness of life, and restores to the heart within the small or great challenges of life that epic breath, that chivalrous, idealistic impetus, which is perhaps what's most lacking in people today, although he does not cease to yearn for it, as the success of The Lord of the Rings itself testifies. What has just been said introduces us well to the next step. It has been said that for Tolkien, human life only becomes truly human, that is, something great, when it is lived as a mission. It has also been said that Tolkien wants us to recover the feeling of the epic dimension of existence, and thus help us rediscover its value and its glory. To get out of the generic and understand what this all means concretely, we must now talk about the concrete content of the mission of Frodo and his companions, as well as the profound nature of the peculiar war, the kind of sui generis war that opposes our heroes against Sauron, which necessarily leads us, therefore, to talk about the Ring of Power. I turn the floor over to Beppe.
Alla fine.
Okay, well, let's go on to the second step of the journey. The first step, man has an epic mission to undertake. Second one, the content of the mission. In the case of the Lord of the Rings, what is the quest of Frodo? So Frodo needs to take the ring to Mount Doom and destroy it by throwing it into the furnaces, and so destroy Sauron's power. So let's get into the deeps. This task is only the culmination of the quest. It's a point of arrival which Frodo will never reach, because, as you recall, in the last moment, right on the edge of the abyss, Frodo refuses to let go of the ring, and it will only be destroyed thanks to the providential but violent intervention of Gollum, this kind of corrupted hobbit who's travelled with him all the time. So Frodo thus fails the ultimate goal of his quest, and this is an element that Tolkien considered crucial and on which we'll return. But the destruction of the ring isn't everything. As Gandalf reveals to him in his opening dialogue, Gandalf, who is the authoritative speaker, Gandalf says to him that Frodo's task is first and foremost to guard the ring, to agree to wear it, but, mind you, not to use it. Frodo must accept to carry the ring, and it becomes his burden, but he mustn't use its power. We can therefore say that the content of Frodo's mission is that of renouncing using the power of the ring. Its destruction is only the apex and the emblem of a more general refusal to use its power. But what does all this mean? What exactly is the power that must be disowned by Frodo, and in general by all the other characters who at some point are called on to renounce the ring, from Gandalf to Borromeo, from Galadriel to Sam? In The Lord of the Rings, it's made of a series of no's said by people to the use of the power of the ring. And so many have wondered, what is the power of the ring? Or should we say, better to say the powers of the ring, the plural? Because the ring has three main powers. First of all, the first power is that of becoming invisible, and so to hide from the sight of others. Bilbo uses this, for example, if you remember, to flee away from his hated cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, and then to disappear during his farewell party. Power of invisibility. Second power is to control the will of other people. As the famous verses on the ring say, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And thanks to this second power, the corruption is thanks to this, Sauron has corrupted and controls the wills of the men who've become the Black Riders, the Nazgul, the slaves of the ring, its most feared servants. The ring also has a third power. It's invisibility, coercion, and the third one, which is less important, but no less obvious, but just important, the power to delay death. And it was with the promise of this power that Sauron ensnared the Black Riders, transforming them into the undead. The Nazgul are undead, people who don't die. And it's thanks to this power of the ring that Gollum and Bilbo acquired an unnaturally long life, a longevity that is not immortality, but again, kind of a non-life, like, quote, butter that has been scraped over too much bread, says Bilbo. So these three powers, invisibility, coercion, longevity, are distinct but related. And all three have to do with the affirmation of one's own individuality through emancipation from others. We could say, more precisely, a freedom intended as independence from others and power over others. Let's have a closer look. The first power, becoming invisible, is, we could say, it's the physical representation of the first desire, that of seeing others without the others being able to see us, avoiding others, separating ourselves from others, because we consider ourselves, or want to be, independent and superior. As Gandalf says in the beginning, when he's recounting the story of Gollum, how Gollum found the ring.
Gollum discovered that when he used the ring, no one in his family was able to see him. Protected by the secret, he kept it with himself, and he used it to find out secrets, and he put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses. It's no wonder that he became unpopular and was shunned when visited by all his relations.
Dalla sua famiglia.
This divided Gollum from his family. The second power, the coercion, is imposing one's own will on that of the others for an affirmation of oneself, of one's own projects and ideas, which violates the great mystery of human freedom. This second power, then, is the one of controlling the others for your own ideas. And listen carefully. This is a fundamental point. This temptation to control the others doesn't have an origin that's necessarily evil or selfish. We see it very well in the case of Borromeo, the great warrior, the heir of an empire, we can say. So as you know what Pope Francis said, the context where we're living, Borromeo is like the last Apollo of an imperial dynasty that's dissolving. So listen to what Borromeo says when he explains to Frodo what he has in mind, what he would do when he's tempted to take over the ring.
E cito.
Behold, in our hour of need, chance brings the light of the Ring of Power. It is a gift, I say, a gift to the foes of Mordor. It's madness not to use it, to use the power of the enemy against him.
The ring would confer the power of command to him, so he could destroy his enemies. End of the citation. A similar case is that of which starts off good, is that of Saruman, who wants the ring in a kind of morbid way, but this obsession is designed to a more general hegemonic project, which is justified, however, by an apparently noble concern. As Saruman explains to Gandalf, he says about Saruman,
We must have power, power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. Saruman is the wise man, he's an intellectual, he's the guy who knows things. There's no hope left in the elves. This is the choice which before us, before you. We may join with that power, to the power of Sauron. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done along the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order.
So the temptation of Boromir and of Saruman, which is the temptation of the second power, is therefore to fight the enemy with his own weapons, to use the ring of Sauron apparently for good, in an attempt to open a hope of victory in a war that's apparently already lost. This is a temptation that Tolkien considered very topical in its historical context in the last half of the last century, and which in fact he explicitly associated with the actions of the Allies in the last months of the Second World War, with precise allusions to the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which Tolkien considered a great tragic mistake. So I made this geopolitical aside, not because I want to introduce a pacifist discussion on the present, but only to remind us that we are not, this evening, we're not talking about just a fantasy world, but if anything, it's through this, through the fantastic, through literature, that we're plumbing the mysteries of human history and the temptations that recur, always the same ones, even in different circumstances. Such as the temptation to destroy or control others in the name of a collective good, or to impose a just vision at the expense of freedom, of good and of truth. But let's get to the third and perhaps most important power of the ring, the power to retard death, to refuse death. That is, to assert one's individuality beyond the rules and the limits of human existence. Rejection death, in Tolkien's view, ultimately means denying the otherness of the Creator and his sovereignty. In the vision of Tolkien, in fact, death is reviled ultimately as a mysterious gift. And so Tolkien established that death that destiny would be completed beyond the walls of the mind, but to stay on this world. So this third power of the ring, man arrives to go against the sovereignty of God. And the theology of the Tolkien world, death is in fact described as God's gift, the supreme gift. The limit is a gift. Tolkien says it well in a letter 157, 156.
Cito.
The view of the myth is that death is not a punishment for the fall, but a biological and therefore also spiritual, since body and spirit are integrated and an inherent part of man's nature. The attempt to escape it is wicked because it's unnatural and silly, because death in that sense is the gift of God.
For Tolkien, fear and the reluctance to accept death are therefore this finiteness of being a creature are therefore closely linked to the problem of the relationship between God and man. Men who are called in the Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's mythology, are called upon to accept his mysterious gift and do an act of supreme trust in him. The temptation of man to delay death, that is precisely the third power of the ring, means ultimately rebelling against God, rejecting to assert your own individuality independently of and against God. Very important, this one. Like in Tolkien's theology, accepting death is the supreme act of hope in another. Those, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, there's a beautiful bit at the end with Aragorn. It's one of the beautiful scenes. To accept to death, accept dying. At the same point, in The Lord of the Rings, renouncing the ring is also an act of hope, an act of trust in the wisdom and the otherness and the wisdom of God, in destiny, God. So who asked Frodo to do this mission? Not to fight evil with evil, but who doesn't tolerate the evil, but decided to entrust to the hobbits the most important mission of history. So here we are entering into the depths of Tolkien's art, which, as he himself wrote in his beautiful letters, has to do with the problem of death and with that of God's sovereignty. The God who created man free, individuals, persons, but in relationships with himself and with the other creatures. A God who reveals his sovereignty through the mysterious gift, almost contradictory gift of freedom and death. So with its threefold power, the ring, which it reveals that in the Tolkien's work, the attempt to separate oneself from others, the first power, to control the freedom of others, the second power, and to prevent death and thus reject one's own limit, the third power. All these three powers are three aspects of the same temptation: to rebel against God's rules and rise above him and his other creatures, to contest and rebel against God's authority in order to assert one's own individuality in an illusory quest for autonomy and supremacy. On the contrary, renouncing the ring means accepting to remain in a relationship with God and his other creatures, even to the point of dying for them, as God himself does, in a paradoxical act that fulfills one's own personality, as we'll see. But time is short, and I cannot dwell as much as I'd like on Tolkien's secondary theology, which is certainly fascinating and perhaps even prophetic. At the end of this second stage, the content of the mission, I would like just to underline that the content of Tolkien's mission is therefore to renounce, to assert one's own individuality independently of, over and against that of others. And so, positively speaking, it means welcoming the mystery of otherness, understood as freedom, created and willed by God. Respecting the freedom of other creatures who cannot be manipulated, even for good ends, but also and above all respecting the freedom of God, who is the origin of the created freedom and who acts in history according to mysterious ways. The content of Frodo's mission is thus closely linked to the mystery of the human person, unique and unrepeatable, yet dependent and related, in a relationship of sonship and therefore of brotherhood. And this introduces us to the next stage, the third stage. Thank you.
Terza tappa.
Third stage, the Fellowship of the Ring, or the mutual promotion, exaltation of personal mission and friendship. If the purpose of the mission is the victory over egocentrism, as we've heard, you can also say it like this, or over the illusion that the fullness of happiness lies in being by oneself and for oneself, autonomy and supremacy. So it's understandable why friendship and companionship cannot but occupy a central place in the Lord of the Rings. They have to be important themes. Living by friendship, in fact, means seeking and finding the fullness of life and glory, finding it not in autonomy and supremacy over others, but on the contrary, in the mutuality, the mutualness of mutual love, in being from and for one another. We can thus catch a glimpse of the real reason why the theme of companionship occupies such a central function of the plot of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, between the goal of Frodo's quest and the way of reaching it, that is to say, thanks to the help of fellow companions on the journey, there is a much deeper game of mirroring than it appears on a superficial reading. One might indeed think that the company of friends is essential for Frodo simply because, as we often say, there is strength in unity. There's strength in numbers. What could Frodo ever do without the help of Gandalf, Aragorn, his trusted Sam, and so on? But it is only in this material sense, so only in this deeply material sense, that companionship plays a decisive role in the path leading to the ring's destruction. We think that that's absolutely not the case. Let's see why. To begin with, let us return to the question of Frodo's choice as ring bearer, considering it, however, from the internal point of view of the author and its position within the story as a whole, that is, as a choice of destiny with a capital D. That is, as Tolkien also says in other texts, of that creator and provident God, who in Tolkien's world takes the name of Ilúvatar, and who acts in Middle-earth especially through the mediation of Gandalf. It's basically an angel. So let's ask ourselves, why does destiny assign to little and inexperienced Frodo such an arduous, if not to say desperate, mission? Why Frodo of all people? Frodo himself asks himself this question.
I wish I'd never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen? Such questions cannot be answered, said Gandalf. You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, nor for power or wisdom, at any rate. But you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have.
In Frodo's choice, there's an element of inscrutable gratuitousness, and you see from Gandalf's reply, that belongs to the nature of all divine choices in the Bible itself as well. Frodo mustn't ask himself why he was chosen. Rather, he must transform his recognition of the sovereign gratuitousness of this choice into a source of confidence and of courage.
Behind this incident the wizard had experienced shortly before, there was something else at work. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, by Sauron, but by a higher will. In this case, you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought.
So, has that said it all? Not quite. Gandalf himself also knows and says that the hobbits are in fact an amazing race. That is to say, endowed with qualities that are unsuspected at first glance. What qualities? Here I'd like to stress one of them, of all the most paradoxical, but also perhaps the most important of them all. Their smallness. Their smallness. There's an exhibition on Saint Teresa here. It's very kind of Tolkien-esque, very the small way. In what sense should hobbit littleness be considered a positive quality and even a gift that makes Frodo more suitable than he seems for this arduous mission? It's Gandalf himself who makes it clear when Frodo would like to entrust him with the One Ring. Precisely because he is great and powerful, Gandalf would not be able to resist the temptation to use the ring to do good, as Beppe reminded us earlier. That is to say, to impose order and justice in the world by force, ending up, therefore, becoming a new Sauron himself, perhaps no better than the first. Frodo, on the contrary, precisely because he's a hobbit, although not immune to, as we know, to the subjugating power of the ring, possesses a sense of his own littleness, of his own weakness, which acts as a natural curb to the illusion of being able to elevate himself to the absolute ruler of himself and of the entire world. We understand, therefore, how reasonable is the choice of a hobbit as a ring-bearer, and of 3 others to accompany him. Hobbits, precisely because they are small and weak, are paradoxically far less than any other being exposed to the seductive power of the ring. And therefore, in a certain respect, they're stronger than any other race. You'd think of St. Paul when he says that I'm weak and therefore I'm strong. When I'm small, therefore I'm great. It's true that even the humble Sam, when the ring temporarily ends up in his hands, will be seized by a sudden delirium of omnipotence, which will lead him to imagine himself for a few moments as the saviour and the reclaimer, Sam was just a gardener of the entire, as the redeemer of all Middle-earth. And yet, if such thoughts do not have much sway over him, it's also because he knows all too well that he is nothing more than a mere hobbit gardener.
So in a crucial moment when Sam thinks he must use the ring to save his master, also deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew that in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such versions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm.
Un reame. In sintesi,
In short, the strength and greatness of hobbits lies first of all in their weakness, their smallness, their littleness. That littleness that makes them, more than all the other beings of Middle-earth, capable of preserving that realistic common sense that the Christian tradition calls humility. That is literally the according to the Latin, the ability to keep one's feet firmly anchored to humus, the earth, without chasing superhuman fantasies, kind of like Icarus does. Thus there emerges a first sense in which having companions on the road is essential for Frodo. Indeed, it's precisely the daily experience of the comfort and the support of trustworthy companions that is for Frodo the most formidable barrier to the seductive action of the ring upon him. An action that repeatedly takes the form of a subtle temptation, the temptation to think that he must go alone, that he must go on alone, as in fact he tries to do several times over the course of the story. In reality, the exact opposite is true, and in fact, destiny ensures that this doesn't happen. At the crucial hour when the Fellowship disbands, Frodo cannot fulfill the quest alone, not so much because he doesn't know the way, as in a material sense of the term. There's a certain irony here. The real kind of journey is not going on your own. Rather, more profoundly, because the purpose of the quest is nothing other than the victory over the demon of individualism, of the illusion of being able to do and be everything by oneself. Let's take another step further, the kind of second half of this third section. It's been said so far that companionship is a shield for Frodo, because it's a barrier to that drive towards autonomy and the severing of all ties that contact with the ring injects into his heart. There's more at play, however. As any reader of Tolkien well knows, the friendship between the members of the Fellowship, and it links to the theme of the meeting, is also the driving force behind almost all the most heroic deeds narrated in The Lord of the Rings. A friendship that grows over time between the various members of the Fellowship, and whose strength gradually manifests itself. Here too, I believe, it's important not to stop on a surface level. That is, we must ask ourselves, is there a connection between the nature of Frodo's mission, that is, the destruction of the One Ring, and everything that implies, that comes with it, and that Beppe spoke so well about? Is there a connection between this and the fact that it is precisely love for one's friend? I think about, especially of Sam Gamgee, that seems to be in the novel the force that enables the greatest victories over the servants of the enemy and over the power of the ring. Obviously, yes, it is, but let's go step by step. First of all, it must be said that what initially creates the bond between the members of the Fellowship is the quest, the mission. Legolas and Gimli, for example, an elf and a dwarf, they've been enemies for centuries between their races. For example, these two would never have become friends if a common quest had not united them on a common path. But there's more. It must also be said that it is precisely the quest that creates the ideal terrain for strong friendships to develop between fellow travelers. Why? We know it. What terrain? I'm referring to that terrain that's called danger. We could say a lot on this topic, but let's move on. Catapulted into an adventure involving the continual risk to their lives. It's the major theme in most literature and movies of our days. The members of the Fellowship are continually put in the position of being able and having to save each other's lives, which, on one hand, creates strong bonds of mutual gratitude and affection, but on the other, careful here, also offers the opportunity to demonstrate this affection to the point of heroism. And here's the beauty in it. It's the inversion, to say, of this dynamic. The mission creates the friendship, but the friendship makes the mission possible. While it's true that friendship is initially generated by the sharing of the mission, as the mission proceeds, one realizes that it's precisely the love for one's friends, or of a friend, increasingly becomes that force which uplifts the individual, giving him the courage and the, if you allow me to say, the fury, the ardor necessary to perform tasks which in the end prove decisive for the fate of their common mission. Let's make we've got two examples here. Let's take the greatest feat of little Mary. What is it that sweeps away from Mary's heart the terror of the Nazgul king, who freezes the blood in the veins of whoever face him, who stands terribly before him? I'd love to be able to read the whole scene that shows this kind of metamorphosis of fear within him, but we don't have the time. Making him capable, what makes Mary capable of inflicting a fatal blow on this evil king? Tolkien says it's a feeling of pity and wonder. Pity and wonder that invades him upon seeing beautiful Éowyn left alone to face this deadly captain. His heart, and I quote,
Pity filled his heart, and great wonder, and suddenly the slow kindled courage of his race awoke. He clenched his hand. She should not die. So fair, so desperate. At least she should not die alone, unaided.
An even more shining example is the unforgettable scene of Sam's duel with Shelob, the great spider. It is Sam's love for Frodo that transforms this little gardener from the Shire into a furious warrior, capable of succeeding even where the greatest heroes of ancient times would probably have failed. Tolkien says,
Frodo was lying face upward on the ground, and the monster was bending over him. Sam did not wait to wonder what was to be done, or whether he was brave, or loyal, or filled with rage. He sprang forward with a yell and seized his master's sword in his left hand. Then he charged. No onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts. Disturbed, as if out of some gloating dream by his small yell, she turned slowly the dreadful malice of her glance upon him. But almost before she was aware that a fury was upon her, greater than any she had known in countless years, the shining sword bit upon her foot and shore away the claw. Sam sprang inside the arches of her legs, and with a quick upthrust of his other hand, stabbed at her clustered eyes upon her lowered head. One great eye went dark. Her vast belly was above him with its putrid light, and the stench of it almost smote him down. Still, his fury held for one more blow. No such anguish had ever known, or dreamed of knowing, in all her long world of wickedness.
Salto un pezzo.
I'll skip a bit. Now, come on, you filth, he cried. You've hurt my master, you brute, and you'll pay for it. We're going on, but we'll settle with you first. Come on and taste it again. Look now, I would love to comment on this, but we don't have time. As if his indomitable spirit had set its potency in motion, the glass blazed, the glass of Galadriel blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that was leaping from the firmament, sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror out of heaven had ever burned in Shelob's face. The beams of this light, entered into her wounded head and scored it with unbearable pain, and the dreadful infection of light spread. Wasn't that nice? The light that wounds, that destroys the evil. This light spread from eye to eye. The comment on these.
Osservazioni.
In commenting on these lines, I allow myself only two interconnected observations. The first concerns Tolkien's beating and rebutting of Sam's more than belligerent, more than fierce ferocity, his fury. Paradoxically, it's precisely the strength and purity of Sam's love for Frodo, that is, that which is the most noble and lofty in him. This is what makes the Hobbit's fury more implacable than that of all beasts. It's a holy anger, a righteous fury, to the point of making it the rival to the ferocity of Shelob herself. Not only the ring, therefore, but also love, seemingly so inoffensive, confers frightening powers upon its bearer, the bearer of the fire of love. It's no coincidence, therefore, that Tolkien is keen to point out that Galadriel's vial seems to intensify its radiance due to contact with the untamed fire that burns in the heart of the enraged Sam. Fire that, as we know, is at one with Sam's love for his master. I'll get towards the end of this third section. It's the flame of Sam's love for Frodo that Tolkien is telling us, which enhances the light that inhabits the stone, causing it to blaze, which also means giving it an incandescence capable of burning the eyes of Shelob. The love is the strength, the strength that permits victory. To conclude this stage, I'd like to underline and emphasize how the communal nature of Frodo's mission finds in Sam's battle against Shelob an emblematic representation. If Frodo's mission does not fail, it's because Sam is with him. But Sam, in turn, does not fail because his confrontation with the monster Shelob does not have of its aim the affirmation of his valor, an act of courage, says Tolkien, but rather it has as its aim the unfolding love of his master, Frodo, where the irony is that this very giving of himself in total self-forgetfulness is exactly what leads him to rise in all his personal greatness. Indeed, to rise far above his natural potential. This introduces us to the next stage.
So, okay, stage 4, which we call the victorious failure of the Mission Impossible. Victorious failure. sorry. The second important paradox, the victorious fashion of the victorious failure. So, in the previous stages, we've introduced the idea that Frodo's mission has a dual dimension, personal and communal. One personal, one communal, individual and cosmic. There's an I, but there's also a you and an us. These two poles, the you and the us, are inseparable for Tolkien. Because if it's true that on one hand the individual needs the totality, the company to fulfill himself, it's in giving himself for the whole that the self is fulfilled. And on the other hand, without the action of the individual, there is no salvation of all. And the whole exists, after all, to give each individual the possibility of fulfillment. Now, why is this the case? So why is there this bipolarity between an I and an us? Or rather, what explanation does Tolkien give for this paradoxical fact of human experience and history? And so to answer this question, we have to go even deeper into the depths of Tolkien's grandiose vision of human events, both individual and collective. We're helped here by a passage from Letter 181, in which Tolkien tackles these questions head-on, answering to a reader's questions about the ultimate meaning of the story of the Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien says, and I'll quote,
L'idea.
The view in terms of my story is that every event or situation in human life has two aspects. Every situation has two aspects. Namely, first aspect, the history and development of the individual. Every event is an opportunity from which to create a definite good, an ultimate good. On the one hand, every event in a person's life is an opportunity to grow and develop his or her personality. On the other hand, every event also has a second aspect, a second dimension. The history of the world, which depends on his action of the individual for its own sake.
Sake, in modo gratuito. Il mondo viene salvato.
The world is saved, that is, Tolkien tells us. So Tolkien tells us with its typical density that the history of the world, that history is made of all the irrepeatable instants of each individual story. The history of the world depends on the gratuitousness with which each individual acts in response to the events of his own history. But what does this mean? What are we saying here? Tolkien makes it clear later, referring precisely to Frodo's mission, which Tolkien describes as a typical sacrificial situation, an extreme situation of human experience. Tolkien says,
there are abnormal situations in which one may be placed. Situations in which the good of the world depends on the behavior of an individual, in circumstances which demand a strength of body and mind which he doesn't possess. Frodo was in such a position.
Frodo's quest, then, and we might say at the bottom, any real quest that's worthy of the name is an impossible quest, a mission impossible from every point of view. And Tolkien carries on.
Era destinata a fallire.
Frodo's mission was doomed to fail, as it was bound to end in disaster, as the story of humble Frodo's development to nobleness, to his sanctification. Fail it would, and did, as far as Frodo's concerned, and Frodo alone was concerned.
So, in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo's quest would have been a complete failure if we considered only from the point of view of the individual success of our hero, the first aspect, or pole, we'd mentioned earlier. On the other hand, we wouldn't be here today if Frodo's quest had failed completely. Every human event also, as we've heard, always has for Tolkien another aspect, as we have seen, which relates it to a larger story of salvation. So our individual story is part of a story that's greater. And indeed, we can say that the ring is destroyed, and as Frodo himself tells Sam in the appendix, he says that at the end, the quest is finally accomplished. So how was this possible? How was this victory, this paradoxical success? We can say certainly not thanks to a heroism of the Hollywood type, the Tom Cruise. Well, Tom Cruise is not the character from Mission Impossible. Sorry, Frodo isn't. If anything, Frodo's quest is successful because it was embraced by Frodo gratuitously. In English, it says, for its own sake, gratuitously. That is, because it had a just purpose and in obedience to a call from destiny. That's enough. This gratuitousness of taking part, of doing it, this is what allows Frodo to go forward without worrying about either the outcome or his own limits, and so without even ever giving in to the temptation to despair or the pride. Frodo's true greatness, Tolkien tells us, is not that of having succeeded in carrying the ring to Mount Doom, but that of having freely accepted, for its own sake, a mission impossible. Giving credit to the circumstances that entrusted it to him, trusting those who made him understand, Gandalf, that this mission was destined really for him, like we heard before. The greatness of Frodo, we can say, and our greatness, the greatness of all of us, is that of having taken on himself his own burden, even though he knew he was not the right, adequate person for such an important mission. Frodo adhered to this mission in obedience to the circumstances of life, which these circumstances, Tolkien says in another beautiful letter, these circumstances are nothing more than the way in which God makes himself present in man's life. Okay, returning to the question we started with, we can now add that Frodo was chosen for this mission because he was aware he was unable to do it, which conversely means that his hope against hope, his hope against hope is his greatest achievement and his necessary contribution to the realization of the mysterious plan of victory against evil, the mysterious plan of Gandalf, which he, the emissary of God, is the key actor. The key virtues of Frodo's heroism are therefore not physical or spiritual strength, wisdom, patience, courage, but rather exquisitely relational virtues, humility, trust, and above all, hope. Frodo is not a suicidal madman. Rather, it must be said that his yes to the mission impossible is reasonable, because it's rooted in the trustworthiness of those who assigned it to him, Gandalf above all, the emissary of God in the Middle-earth. And so trusting Gandalf for Frodo means trusting, more or less consciously, in the one who sent him, and thus making Gandalf's hope his own, which is the hope of winning against Sauron without using the power of evil, without using the power of the ring, trusting only in God's mysterious plan, which, as we've seen, requires giving up the power of the ring. Embracing his mission freely, even though he knows he will fail, this is what makes Frodo do a great act of hope. That is, he accepts to neither be the master of his own story, nor the one who brings it to completion. The one who brings it to completion, in fact, is destiny, or God, the great author of history, says Tolkien in a letter, the great author who is never named but is always present in The Lord of the Rings. Going back to the polarity we were talking about before, it can also be put like this. An individual's history is fulfilled just at the moment when the individual accepts to belong to a greater history, and therefore he accepts to die, to fail, hoping in the Lord of that history. Our individual history, therefore, can, and indeed in a certain sense must fail if it wants to contribute to the fullness, to the history of the world, to the fulfillment of the world. And this always requires an opening yourself up to the decisive eruption of another. This is the great paradox at the heart of the Lord of the Rings, at the heart of the story, which is at the bottom, the great paradox of God's power. We're already running out of time, so I'll conclude on this fourth stage. But before leaving the word to Paolo for the conclusion, I will read you one last passage in which Tolkien closes the circle of his reasoning. He focuses on what he considers to be the most important action in Frodo's story, namely his decision to take pity on Gollum. So remember, Frodo has the possibility to kill Gollum, this hobbit corrupted one, but in obedience to Gandalf he doesn't do it. And here's what Tolkien says.
But at this point, the salvation of the world and Frodo's own salvation is achieved by his previous pity and forgiveness to his ability to forgive slights. Gollum would certainly betray him and could rob him in the end. To pity him, to forbear to kill him, it was a piece of folly, or a mystical belief in the ultimate value in itself of pity and generosity, even if disastrous in the world of our time.
Bellissimo.
I find this beautiful. Mercy for Gollum is the supreme act by which the individual Frodo accepts the folly of his mission in the name of a mystical affirmation of the value of pity. Mercy, which is not by chance the chief attribute of God, as Tolkien himself says in another letter. Loving Gollum, the great enemy, is thus the apex of Frodo's mission, his definitive renunciation of the power of the ring. Mercy is the great antidote to power, an expression at once of charity towards the other and of trust in God's power. This mercy to Gollum is in fact the moment in which Frodo definitively accepts the partiality of his own story, a story his story is part of the great story of God, the Lord of good, to whose justice and wisdom Frodo entrusts himself with his act of profound pity. The mercy for Gollum, pity, is finally the act with which Frodo definitively accepts his personal failure, because he knows that Gollum will betray him. Indeed, Tolkien concludes,
Gollum did rob him and injure him in the end, but by grace that last betrayal was at a precise juncture when the final evil deed was the most beneficial that anyone could have done for Frodo. The betrayal of Gollum is what allows him to destroy the ring. By a situation created by his forgiveness, he was himself saved and relieved of his burden. He was very justly accorded the highest honors.
His mission was completed and he was given honor. It's thanks to his act of mercy, which is also his supreme act of gratuitousness and trust in God and hope, that Frodo's mission can be accomplished by grace. Frodo thus truly becomes a hero and is therefore justly rewarded and honored. Not only is victory against Sauron achieved, but also his personal journey of ennoblement is concluded and beyond all expectations. In fact, Frodo has not become a hero in the classical sense of the term, and yet he's been introduced to something even greater, much, much greater, the mystery of the heroism of love of God, that love which the mystery of the and now I'll leave the word to Paolo.
Adesso è molto tardi.
It's very late now, so it's a very, very brief conclusion here. It's only half a page. We saw in the third stage how love, the giving of self, gives victorious strength, as in the case of Sam in the battle with Shelob. In the fourth stage, on the other hand, We saw how this love from the other for self leads to accepting one's own personal failure, and how having mercy on the enemy in the gratuitous affirmation of a good that transcends time and space. Let's now ask ourselves, why does this love that goes to the uttermost seem to be the only force that leads to victory over the enemy? The answer in the end is simple. Because love, that love of charity which finds in laying down one's life for one's friends its perfection, it's the only experience in which the creature is given to taste a power greater and corresponding to the heart of every power that the ring confers. Or to put it another way, if charity is the true anti-ring, as we've seen in the last two stages, it's because clinging to the heart of his flame makes one taste the possession of a power that truly makes one similar to the mighty one par excellence, namely God, and therefore frees one from the seductive allure of the ring, which promises divine glory, but in reality neither gives it nor can give it. And it cannot give it not so much because it doesn't give power, it does give power, but rather because the power that the ring does give ultimately has little that's divine about it. If it's true what John says, and Tolkien would subscribe to that, it's namely that God is charity. God is charity, and indeed mutual charity, reciprocal charity, that is, friendship. And so it's only through friendship, when it has the grace to be deep and true friendship, that a creature comes to experience the divine, and thus receives the power to overcome the power of the ring. In conclusion, in Christianity, he who loves most wins, someone's famous said. We add, this is the case in Tolkien's work as well. And what about Frodo? Did Frodo not lose the duel with the ring? No, actually, he did not lose it. And this is not only because of the readiness to sacrifice himself that he showed, nor is it only because of the mercy he knew to show for Gollum, mercy that was in fact a harbinger of victory, as we've heard, but also because in his perseverance against all reasonable hope, he staked everything, not on himself, but on the one who had called him. And by doing so, he loved fully. For love is not only in giving, but in opening oneself to receive. Not only in giving oneself totally, but also in this giving oneself, in entrusting the success of one's gift totally to the beloved. Is this not the case in every friendship? In every love between people? Friendship wants equality, equalness, reciprocity. And what reciprocity of love could there be between Frodo and destiny, if Frodo did not bet on destiny just as foolishly as destiny bet on him? We've finished now. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
civiltà dell'amore. Fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.